Welcome again to this Mossy Stories, and we have Tim Purches, bryologist living in Plymouth, and amazingly helpful and supportive of our work to get people to be more aware of mosses and understand their role in our environment at the same time as thinking about reflecting back about what moss-like powers we might have ourselves. And John Walters as well, who is an ecologist and an artist and has agreed to let us know and find out a bit more about the mini beasts and the creatures that live in moss or depend on moss. So thank you to you both. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to Chloe. Chloe is a colleague.
Hanging on the ceiling. I don't know what's going on, anti-gravity or something setting in my office. But hello everyone from the upside down. I am going to be talking about the exciting things that are happening with the Mossy Carpet project over the course of the next year. Some of you will know, and we are very grateful to everyone, that our crowdfunder to support the development of the Mossy Carpet, to produce 50 meters of carpet and have thousands of people join in order to produce a celebration event, celebrating all the tiny things that people are doing to make the world a better place in August of this year in Plymouth. So what the plans are there's going to be a Dartmoor tour in February. So we're going to be visiting places in Princetown and Oakhampton and Ivybridge in February this year, and then and everyone is invited to come along and join in and see the Mossy Carpet and talk about Dartmoor and the mosses on the moor and our hopes for the future. In April, we're going to be holding a North Devon tour. So we're going to be in Barnstable and Braunton, and we will be also inviting people to come and join in making and celebrating and finding out about mosses up in North Devon. Now, between now and July, we'll be running loads of events in Plymouth. So if you're wondering where we're going to be in Plymouth and what we're going to be doing, I'd like to encourage you to have a look at the events page on our website, and we'll be populating those as we go across the year. So we're really hoping that loads of people are going to be able to join in, getting creative, finding out more about the wonderful mosses that we live with, and also recording their messages, which are going to be integrated into the carpet. Now, I know it is one of the things that I'm personally really excited about is the sorts of messages that people are going to be able to leave in the carpet. So part of the thing that I'm really excited about is a poetry competition that we're hoping to launch in the next month or two. And that will be inviting people to write poems that explore mosses, to explore the tiny things that we're all doing, the power that we have within to make the world a better place, and celebrating creativity. And hopefully there'll be a slam later on in the autumn online where everyone can join us online. But also I'm looking forward to those words going into the carpet too. Now, if you haven't seen the carpet in action and heard the tardigrade tell its tales, then please do come along to one of our in-person events and have a stroke of the carpet, because it is quite bonkers and magical. Probably more bonkers than having someone present to you upside down on the screen, but not much more bonkers than that.
I can't think of anything much more bonkers than that.
No, I know. I'm sorry about that. I don't know what's going on. So 2 other things just before I finish. Looking forward to a storybook this year. So a Mossy storybook. If you've got any ideas or thoughts about Mossy stories, please share them with us. And additionally, because of the success of the crowdfunder, we're also planning on being at the RHS Flower Show in Hampton Court Palace in July. So who knows how much bigger this is going to grow. If anyone's out there and wants to get involved creatively and run their own Mossy carpet sessions with their community, then we are really up for celebrating that and helping anyone with that. So I'm gonna stop there, and I'm gonna turn my video off for the rest of the session because it is just really disconcerting hanging on the ceiling.
Thank you, Chloe. Sorry to make you do it even upside down. Jenny, have you got anything to add about Plymouth carpet?
Just adding my own spotlight. Yeah, so I guess the thing with the Plymouth events at the moment is we have quite a lot of people interested, but if you have a connection or an idea for where you'd like to see and a community that you think would really like to join in, then please do drop us an email. I'm going to ask Kat to pop an email address in the chat. We can't do them all, but as Chloe was saying, part of the idea is to be able to provide the resources for groups and communities to be able to get involved. So we're very happy to have those conversations and sort of give you a few hints and tips about how to join in. And we're really excited to go out and meet lots of new people. I'm looking forward to going to Princetown, to the visitors centre this weekend, where there's a session for the youth rangers, Dartmoor National Park. So young people who are very used to going out and getting kind of hands-on on the moor. So I'm excited to hear some of their stories and to share our kind of creative approach to it and see how it all ties in.
Yeah, great. And on Dartmoor, when we're running some sessions in Ivy Bridge and Princetown and Oakhampton, we're really hoping to meet a whole big wide range of new groups and get them interested in the mosses that are just on their doorstep as well as up on Dartmoor. So thanks everyone. I can see there's a nice range of chat going on, Kat, and everyone's beginning to respond and looks exciting. So keep that going. Now, so I talked about some of the getting new communities interested in Dartmoor, and I think that's probably a good time now then to hand over to Tim Purches to tell us a little bit more about 10 more mosses who grow, making them sound like humans. They are living beings, but these mosses growing on Dartmoor, and we'd love to hear a bit more about them, Tim.
Okay, let me just get my presentation up. So I think that should be it. Okay, so the previous two talks, I took you on a journey up from Plymouth up onto Dartmoor, looking at the habitats we would find on the way and picking out a few species of moss that you should be able to easily identify for yourself. So this time it's purely a walk just on Dartmoor. Again, looking at some of the habitats you would come across, would encounter on such a walk, and picking out some easy to identify mosses that you can spot for yourself without the need for a hand lens or a magnifying glass or anything like that, apart from one right at the very end. So I wanted to start, start in woodland. This is sort of woodland we would find usually around the edges of Dartmoor. And the first of the mosses I wanted to look at was the white mosses. Now, we now think there are 3 of them in this country. There used to be 2, but there's still a lot of work going on to understand our moss flora. And in the last few years, they've decided there are 3 of them. They all look quite similar, though. They're quite compact, pale hummocks of moss, and they can get to quite a size as well. So in this next image, that rounded lump sort of just below the middle there, that is one of the white mosses. Now, the other moss hummocks you're looking at are probably mosses growing on rocks and boulders, but that hummock will be almost entirely white moss. So they really do form quite a substantial lump if they're given the chance to grow away. And it's really nice to run your hand over them and feel just how firm they are. The next species is another moss that stands out because of its pale colour, and this is waved silk moss. People often say it looks a bit like green worms, and those branches you're seeing there, they're quite substantial. They can be 4, 5 or 6 centimetres long. It grows on woodland floor. You can also find it growing on the bases of hedge banks and places like that. And as you can see from the inset, something else that makes it quite distinct is the leaves that undulate, they're wavy. So that's another distinctive feature of it that enables you to be pretty sure what it is you're looking at. The third species is actually related to one of the species I looked at last time. You might remember springy turf moss, which is a very urban moss. It grows in lawns in towns and cities. This is a very close relation. It's in the same genus, but this is one you find much more up on Dartmoor. It's one of the species used as a temperate rainforest indicator. It's quite similar to the springy turf moss. It has those red stems and curved leaves, but it's a much stiffer, upright moss. It can be really attractive to look at. And again, quite easy to spot growing on the woodland floor and on boulders and places like that. Now on to mosses that grow in and around streams and rivers. And the first of these is shining hookeria, and it really does shine. You can see from the right-hand picture, it's quite a substantial moss, and its shoots are quite flat, and they really are quite glossy. It really does stand out. And this is a moss you find growing on banks, alongside streams and rivers, and even alongside ditches and other wet places as well. Really, one that really sticks out. The next two mosses, in fact, the Fontanalis species, these are very aquatic mosses. They're completely aquatic mosses. We have one species that's perhaps commoner on Dartmoor, and another species I tend to see more down in the lowland areas. And this has quite long stems that are 20, 30, even 40 centimeters long, and they grow with one end attached to a boulder in and beneath the surface of the water, and the rest of the stem trails downstream, and you can see it waving in the flow of water if you look down into a river or a stream from a bridge or alongside it. I tried to find a good photo of it. Actually, when the water was high, I did struggle a bit, but you can see from the larger photograph that it's quite substantial. So when the level of the water drops, you get quite great carpets of this moss lying across the boulders in the stream bed. And one other additional fact of interest, the species that's less common on Dartmoor is actually sold as an oxygenating weed for ponds and also for fish tanks. So you can actually buy it online should you want to. The final sort of wetland species of moss is a particular favourite of mine, alpine thread moss. I love this one because of its lovely rich red colour. And that image doesn't really catch how metallic the colour is as well. I think that's a close up, so it's a smaller moss, 2 or 3 centimetres high, but it's another one that really sticks out if you come across it when you're out walking on the moors. So now we're getting up higher. We're up out of the woodland, up onto the higher moor, where we're seeing much more of the tors, and we're seeing boulders, and we're seeing dry stone walls. And another quite substantial moss is this one, woolly fringe moss. It really just like growing on rocks and boulders and on wall tops. To give you an idea of scale, that clump could easily be 15, 20 centimeters long, perhaps even more. It's quite a stiff moss as well, so those shoots all stick up quite firmly. The ends of the leaves all end in a drawn out white portion, and that's what really helps give it its name of a woolly fringe moss, because of the woolly appearance of it. The next moss is a much smaller one. Again, it's a moss you find growing in thin soil on tops of dry stone walls and boulders, only centimetre or 2 centimetres long. It's one of the haircat family, and as I mentioned in the last talk, the haircats are different from a lot of the other mosses in that their leaves are quite thick and stiff. Most mosses have leaves that are perhaps a cell thick. These are much thicker. This is smaller than the common haircat that I showed you last time, which is quite a big, substantial one. But it is quite an easy one to pick out amongst the haircats because its leaves all ends you can just about make out in that image in a long white hair. And like with the woolly fringe moss, it's believed this helps it to collect and hold on to water. Because though it lives on Dartmoor, nevertheless, living on top of a wall, when it gets dry in the summer, it needs all the help it can get. So we're going to finish up with two species now, but species of damp and boggy areas. And the first of these is bog bead moss, another quite substantial moss that is very much associated with damp areas, often found around and sometimes in sphagnum moss. Stands out because of its lovely golden colour, which you can see there. And you get an idea of scale that those shoots are often several centimetres long. And another interesting feature of it, which you see if you look much closer, is that the bases of the stems are covered in this red fuzz, which are red rhizoids, red sort of root-like structures. But that makes it easy to be sure it is what you think it is you found. I'll finish up now with our final species. This is our one and only liverwort in this talk. Not such an easy one to find, nowhere near as common as the other ones, and really quite tiny. But this, as its scientific name suggests, is a real specialist of sphagnum moss. It actually lives exclusively within the mosses, the sphagnum moss itself. And you can see the tiny shoots that are threaded throughout that quite attractive clump of sphagnum. And here's just a closer look so you can see a little bit better the structure and again that almost golden brown colour of the moss. So there you are. That's 10 more bryophytes, moss and liverwort species that most of them you can find for yourself if you go out on a walk on Dartmoor. So there you are. And I shall stop the screen sharing now.
That's really interesting. And I've got one or two questions, but I don't know whether anybody, well, while I'm asking my questions, if anyone in the audience wants to ask a question, then please do. So far, we're getting some thank yous and some fantastic names. The names are really interesting, aren't they? The way
they are, yeah. The common names. Well, I think for mosses, they generally don't have a lot of really ancient common names. They've been given common names in recent years, but they picked some really, really interesting and fascinating names that I really enjoy.
Yeah. Well, I wondered whether you could remind us again the difference between liverworts and mosses, because there was one moss early on that was in the woods, I think, that had quite leafy, flat structures. If I found that, I think I was looking at a liverwort, and I know that the two groups sort of overlap. Well, some not overlap, but in the structure, they do a
little bit. Yes, so they're both very ancient groups of plants going back 400 million years. You do well to pick out. There are really two species of moss that people get confused with the liverworts. It's difficult to pin down something that's a really simple feature. But if you look closely at the leaves of mosses, quite a lot of them have a nerve, a thick what they call a costa that runs up the middle of it that gives the leaf some strength. The liverworts don't have those at all if it's a leafy liverwort. Yeah. If they're fruiting, the structure of a moss sporophyte of the capsule, it's a much more substantial and complex structure than the much simple sporophyte you get from liverworts. And of course, pretty much all mosses have leaves, whereas some liverworts don't have leaves at all. They're just sort of plates of tissue.
Thank you. That's really handy. Has any of the rest of my team colleagues got a question for Tim? Because I can ask another one.
I've got a question. You talked about how lots of the names for mosses are not really very ancient, and I wonder, is that because why is that? Why don't we have old names for mosses so often?
Yeah, that's another really interesting question. I don't know. My assumption is that it's because plants had a much more that they were much more had a much great cultural value and medicinal value, and they were used for food and things like that. So they were perhaps much more of interest to people in that. They're much more important. I suspect some of the moss names are quite ancient, more of the older ones. But some of the species of moss are really tiny and small, and you need a microscope even to identify for sure what they are. So they tended to be of interest to more people who are much more interested in nature and in wildlife. The scientific names and the identification of the species do go back hundreds of years. but they were perhaps more of a specialist pastime rather than being of a genuine interest.
Thank you. That's a good answer. Good answer, obviously. But it's we're quite interested in why things are called something, you know, when they have multiple uses as well, you know, sort of what.
Yeah, I think as I'm sure you know, with the flowering plants, ones, quite a lot of them, the more obvious ones and the important ones, often have lots of different names in different parts of the country. Because of they were important to those communities. But that's not something, as far as I'm aware, you find with mosses and bryophytes.
Yeah, and there's another question for you, Tim, here from Jane Ackerman, and she has said, are bog bead moss and bog moss flatwort associated with particular species of sphagnum?
So the bog bead moss is more one you would find in any sort of damp area. That's liverwort. I'm not quite so sure. I don't see it a lot myself. When I find it, it does tend to be associated with the better quality bogs on Dartmoor, and that means it's associated with the sphagnum mosses that you're more likely to find on the better quality bogs on Dartmoor. So I usually see it in some of the species like the red bog moss, Sphagnum capillifolium, which likes that high quality environment, but it's not particularly associated with just one species, but it just likes the same habitat as certain of the sphagnum species like.
Yeah, okay, that's good. And I have written on my notes that I've been taking, I've written sort of symbiosis, or you know, that complete reliance on one species to another when they're both gaining from it. And I don't know whether there are examples of that with the mosses. That last liverwort, the bog moss flatwort, looked like it might gain from that particular species in a good bog, but are there any other examples?
Not really. If they have a relationship, it's just that they like growing in the same area, and it may be that one provides a habitat for a different one to grow in. There's no real relationship, as far as I'm aware, in terms of one is a parasite on the other, or it needs the other one. There is perhaps one species of liverwort which I've never seen, but I can't bring it to mind, that doesn't actually contain and doesn't contain any chlorophyll, so it can't photosynthesize for itself. So it must parasitize off something. And it is associated with sphagnum mosses, but I'm getting very quickly out of my depth here. So
no, that's fine. Yeah. So that interrelationship between different living things will lead to John. But we have got one question here which says, how many species of moss are there in the UK compared to the number of species of liverworts? That's from Rhiannon.
Yeah, I should have checked up on that. There are somewhere just over 1,000 species of bryophyte within the country. I think there's certainly more mosses than there are liverworts. It's about 600 to 400 or 700 to 300. So you might say, you know, just over half or perhaps 2/3 of the bryophytes we have are mosses rather than liverworts.
Yeah.
Interesting question. I might check that up afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So lovely to have another 10 mosses, Tim, and we will put them onto our, you know, the YouTube recording of this broadcast, so that those that are keen in the audience that have just come for the first time, there's 2 more recordings. So in all, you can catch up on 30 different moss stories from all sorts of habitats, from pavement outside your door, whether you're living in a village or a city, right up on to the wildest places of the moor, the best bogs, well, I call it the best bogs, but you know, the ones with the more unusual sphagnum, with all those reds and bronze colours in them. So thank you, Tim. And we're then now moving on to John's presentation, which is about the mini beasts that live in the moss. And it will be interesting to find, John, whether there are some mosses that only hold particular mini beasts, or whether actually it's the wet greenness of
yeah,
of
well,
the
it could be a
environment.
bit,
So we'll see what you have to show us, and then we might ask
be a
you
bit
some
of both.
questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And thanks to Tim. That was very interesting. I learned a few things about moths. I'll just try and share my. Where's the sharing? Share screen. Right. Can you see that?
Not here.
Share. Oh, there's another button that says share.
So everything that we every system has a slightly different arrangement. of
Yeah, and it's as soon as I go into this, I can't actually. I did it just now. But I'll just come out. So share the screen. Share that. Oh, here we go. I can see it now. There's that one. So that should work now, hopefully. Can you see that? Or not?
No, no, I know you did
Oh.
it. You did it before.
Oh, right. Yeah, I did it before. And I can see it on here now, but oh, here we go. Does that work? That should work.
No,
Does that not work?
no, sorry, John.
Screen sharing has failed. Please try again later. Do that.
You can't do it
Um,
later. You've got to show it now.
Yeah, that's the trouble. I lose control of my mouse. Right, let's start again.
Yeah.
So I've got that there. Share the screen. Share that one and share that.
There we are. You've started sharing. Fantastic.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah, it got the message in the end.
Yes.
Okay.
So we're very happy that it's come in the end, and
Yeah, well, yeah, it's
And
always
it's
a
also nice to
technical.
yeah, it's also nice to have human interactions while we're doing it. So yes,
Yeah,
mini
all
beasts
these
in the
things.
moss.
They sometimes go smoothly, other times they don't work. But anyway, thanks for coming along and listening to us this evening. I'm going to talk a little bit about mini beasts in the moss and some other bigger creatures as well. The presentation will last about 10 minutes. And I'll just give you a brief introduction to myself for those who don't know me. I live in Buckfordsley, just on the southern edge of Dartmoor. I lived here for about 30 years now. I originally come from Hayling Island in Hampshire. And I've been interested in wildlife natural history ever since I was about 3. So I'm always out and about, been out day to day, looking at things, all sorts of natural history, from insects to birds and mammals and mosses even sometimes. So I'm interested in everything, and I like to explore the natural world through observation, through drawing and painting in the field. This is out actually in Austria this time last year. Sat out in the snow drawing some wall creepers. So I've been out, and this is what I've been doing this afternoon. Now I was drawing some wrens this afternoon out in the cold. So I sit out take my sketchbook and pencils and paper and go out in the field and find things to draw. So whatever it is, this is a hornet robber fly out on the East Devon pebble bed heaths in the late autumn last year. But it could be anything. So at this time of year, there's mainly birds I'm doing because there's not many insects around. But if there's insects about, I often get distracted by those. That's a brimstone butterfly. And I use these illustrations in a variety of books which I've written or co-written, books on the wildlife of Dartmoor, which has got some mosses in there. It's out of print now, unfortunately, but you might be able to find one in the library or maybe online somewhere. I've produced guides on mini beasts with Pete Smithers, who I know Jane, who's tuned in, will know very well. But others of you may well know Pete as well. And life in the rock pools and all sorts of. So as I said, I'm interested in all sorts of wildlife. I also write a little section in the Dartmoor magazine, and I might do one on mosses. Actually, I feel inspired now to go out and after that advice from Tim to go out and I've seen some of those mosses, but I didn't necessarily know what they were. So I go out and the way I do is to go out and try and draw things and then get to know them a little bit more closely that way. So that's a recent spread I've done for the Dartmoor magazine on Dumbledores and various things connected with dung. The latest edition's got one on dippers, and I've just written one all about fish, including mainly about the lampreys, but catch that one in the spring issue if you're interested in those. And I also produced some cards from my field paintings of, as you can see, a wide variety of subject. I do a lot of, as well as drawing and painting, I do a lot of photography as well and video work, and I use these cameras. So I use a Sony RX10 Mark IV bridge camera, the big one on the left, a Canon SX70 with a woolly top to stop the wind noise affecting the microphone, and a little Olympus tough camera as well, which is really good for doing close-up photographs. And also I use in recent years, so about this time last year, I got hold of one of these, which is a thermal imager, which I got originally to look for birds at this time of year. So this was at the weekend. I've been looking for a woodcock, which is, those who don't know, a bird which doesn't breed on Dartmoor, but we get a lot of woodcock which migrate here from Scandinavia and further east into Russia, and they come here for the winter. And there's quite a few on Dartmoor, but they're incredibly difficult to see. But using the thermal imager, actually, it just tells the difference. It shows a differential temperature for whatever you point it at. So in the winter when it's really cold, this is on Saturday, everything's cold apart from the bird. So the birds, as you can see in the middle picture, shows out like a beacon. And it still took a while to see the woodcock, as you can see there. It's just sat incredibly camouflaged. It's quite a reasonably big bird, like a wood pigeon-sized bird, but it's so hard to see. And without the thermal imager, I'd never have been able to see it. Now that's on a cold day, but once you get into the spring, or sort of late winter, or even a day like today, when I was out looking for woodcock, I noticed that quite a lot of the vegetation warms up. And one of the things that warms up particularly is moss. And some of the mosses, like I don't know this particular species, but Tim, I'm sure, will know it, are often a sort of place that I often associate adders when they come out in the spring with mosses, and they will sunbathe on these mosses. And I always wondered why. But using the thermal camera, I found that actually these mosses warm up and they show us hot spots in the landscape. So they warm up quite quickly, as the bracken does as well. So the adders actually seek out these places because they are actually quite warm, which I wouldn't have really thought of as a thing for mosses. I always thought mosses are cold and damp, but they actually can be quite warm substrates. So that's an adder just come out of hibernation. They usually come out in about the middle of February into March. And as I said, they will seek out patches of moss to sunbathe on in nice sunny little spots. And then in the springtime, about April time, their breeding season starts. And that's when you see the males with the amazing pale blue colours with the black zigzags on the back. At about the same time in March, one of my favourite birds, the long-tailed tit, will start to build its nest. And they each pair builds an elaborate construction. It's like a dome-shaped nest, and it's made out of moss and lichen, and also spiders' webs. So the birds will collect little spider egg cocoons, and then they will weave them together. It takes a week or 2 weeks to build this nest. But then they will collect lichens from trees and also mosses as well, various sorts of mosses. Again, I don't know the exact species, but it would be interesting to know if they like particular ones. And maybe this is for warmth as well, I'm just thinking about it on the top of my head. But they certainly do like mosses. And in places where there aren't so many lichens in other parts of the country, they mainly use moss, because in some parts of the world, in some parts of the UK where pollution means that there's less lichen on the trees, they will predominantly use mosses, whereas on Dartmoor, obviously, we've got rich supply of lichens as well. So the long-tailed tits will build their nests with all this nice, snuggly, warm lichen and moss. Obviously, it's a nice, warm structure, and then they'll raise their young in the nest. And that's quite a mossy nest. That was up at Menford Reservoir a few years ago, and that's the young ready to fledge, usually in May. Other creatures use moss as nesting material, and this is the moss carder bee. Now, carder bees are the orange bees. There's a common carder bee, which you may well almost certainly see in local parks or gardens. And that one, they're called carder bees because they collect pieces of grass and moss, and they will card them. They'll cut them into little sections, and then they'll make a nest similar to the long-tailed tit in a way, not so woven together, but they'll nest above ground, usually about ground level or slightly above ground level in a grass tussock or a similar situation to that. So the moss carder bee is maybe using this as an insulating or warmth collecting material as well. So it's quite a rare bee in Devon. You can find a few around Braunton boroughs, but this photograph was taken in Ireland, and it's much commoner further north. And other insects use moss as shelter in parts of their life cycle. So this is the caterpillar of the narrow-bordered beehawk moth, which is quite a rare moth, but it has localized populations on Dartmoor. And the moth, as I'll show you a little video in a minute, looks like a bee. And the caterpillar feeds on devil's spit scabious, and it lives in damp meadows, special meadows. But at this time of year, the chrysalis overwinters, so the pupa or chrysalis is tucked in amongst some moss, and they always, when I found them anyway, they always pupate in little mossy tussocks. And this is obviously keeps them away from the water as much. I mean, they're often in raised clumps, so they don't get drowned out. But it also keeps them sort of nice and dry and well protected as well in amongst the moss. So the moths will emerge from them in May. And there's a little bit of video, some narrow-bordered beehawk moths, and the female is just hatched. You can see she's probably just come out of this mossy tussock here, and then the male will come in and mate with her. Incredible moths. They do look just like bees until you slow them down like this, and you can see they've obviously got long antennae, so they're not bees. That's the narrow-bordered beehawk moth. And it's a sort of mossy colour as well, and it often sits on the moss, and it has that beautiful sort of slightly orangey green tint to it with a little bit of buff in, and just blends in perfectly with the mosses. There's the male flying off. Other moss habitats are quite damp. So this is in Whitewood, which is near Bench Tor, near Benford Reservoir. And these woods, these amazing woodlands, classic sort of Atlantic forest woodlands, are very damp and lots of mossy boulders and all sorts of damp habitats. And the moss and the lichens fly all over the trees. So it's a bit like somewhere out of Lord of the Rings, you know. It's the most beautiful woodland I know, and it's probably as beautiful as any woodland in the world. If you haven't been into one of these woods and you want to go and have a look at this one in particular, it's quite easy to access from Benford Reservoir. If you walk down into the valley there, opposite the reservoir, and you'll find the path through the woodlands there. And it's best to see it about mid to late April before the leaves have come out, but the sun's quite strong, and then you get these amazing shadows of the trees all over the mossy boulders. Now, in these woodlands, in the damp sort of mossy habitats, which are quite a shelter, live all sorts of insects. This is an ant, Myrmica ruginodis, which lives in damp habitats. It's quite many ants live in warm places, warm, dry places, but this one quite likes to live in damp places. So you can find it deep in amongst moss tussocks. It's quite often where I see this ant. And there's actually a little woodlouse there as well. And that white thing at the bottom is a woodlouse, a special woodlouse which lives in ant nests. And other creatures which live in that woodland really like the wet, damp woodland. So this is the world's largest slug, the ash black slug. And it can grow up to 1 foot long. So it's a real monster slug. And it lives on Dartmoor. It lives in ancient woodlands, nice mossy, damp ancient woodlands. And as I said, it can grow up to 30 centimetres long. So truly amazing thing. You may have seen it. I did a bit of work for Wild Isles, the Attenborough series that was on this time last year. So you may have seen some of the stuff I helped them with, which is the amazing mating of the ash black slug, where they hang off a tree trunk at night and mate. And a special beetle lives there as well. And this is the Blue Ground Beetle. And this is a slug munching specialist, and it loves mossy woodlands like the Dart Valley on Dartmoor, Hornsey Dendles Wood, and places like that, these ancient rainforest, Atlantic rainforest habitats. And the beetle is active at night during the springtime, early summer. But during the winter, it chooses to hibernate under dead bark, which is sort of moss-covered bark. moss covered bark, and then you get these carpets of moss growing on the dead branches. You can lift these up and have a look underneath, and sometimes you'll find one of these beetles sat underneath. A really beautiful beetle. Other inhabitants of the moss are really quite tiny, and one of the commonest creatures are the springtails. Springtails are ancient relatives of insects. I'm not sure if they're truly classified as insects anymore, but they have 6 legs and they are super abundant, but not so often seen unless you get really down on your hands and knees with a magnifying glass. And there's a whole variety of different sorts of springtails, and they live in this forest, this mini forest on trees and on the ground. And they have, as there's this plentiful source of food, there's a number of predators, and there's a few beetles which I'll talk about, which specialize in eating springtails. This one is a springtail stalker, and this one lives in that dim environment, but it has huge eyes which enable it to detect its prey, so it will stalk the springtails and catch them and eat them. This is another one called Loricera and Loricera, maybe a better way of pronouncing it. And this one has strange antennae with spikes on it. And this one also specializes in catching springtails. And what it does is it curls those spiky antennae around a springtail and then entraps it, and then it will munch it with its jaws. So it uses its antennae as a springtail trap. And another one called Leistus, a plate jaw ground beetle. And this one has big black plate jaws with lots of spikes underneath. And that one will trap springtails underneath the jaws and catch them in the spike. So this one, all these creatures will lurk in amongst that mossy jungle. And as you can see from my hand there, they're not very big. So they're only about sort of less than 10 millimeters long, so 10 maybe is a maximum size for one of these beetles, and the little springtail stalker is even smaller than that. But amazing creatures in their own right. Other things are even smaller, but really quite endearing. And this one, I expect to eat springtails and any other things it can find. It's a relative of the spiders, and it's a false scorpion. So it's quite a cool little creature with these great big long arms with these sort of little pincers on. And I've never seen it catch anything, but I presume it must lurk around in the moss and the leaf litter. And then when it finds its prey, it will zap them with these big pincer arms. Really lovely little creature. But again, it's tiny and just a few millimeters long, but quite common. And I'll just finish off with another one, which is a strange little creature called a snow flea. And this one is always associated with the polytrichum or the haircat mosses. And you always find it living in these jungles of these mosses. It's active in the winter, which is why it gets its name snow flea, because it's quite unobtrusive little creature. It's not uncommon in the UK, but it's very difficult to find. But when it snows, you may find it hopping around on the snow. It's actually a kind of scorpion fly, but it's one which has lost its wings and now lives in amongst the moss and predates other insects. So there we go. Finish off with a picture of the snow flea, one of those sort of strange creatures that lives all around us, but unless you really go searching for it, you may never have seen one. Okay, well, thanks for listening. And if anyone's got any questions, I'll be happy to answer. I'll just stop sharing the screen. Stop share.
That was amazing, John. We haven't had anyone talk to us about all the tiny creatures that can live in the wilderness of the mossy forest. We've had someone go microscopic with the tardigrades and the rotifers, the tiniest things. But it was great to hear about that. I'm looking to see whether in the chat there's some specific questions. There is one here. It says, do you have any IR pics of the moss? What's that mean?
Infrared?
Oh, infrared. Oh, yeah. I have got some, but my little thermal scope isn't that brilliant. It's good at finding things, but it hasn't got a very high definition camera on it.
No.
So I could show you that, but it would just look like a load of blobs of white. So imagine that woodcock, but a lump of moss, and that's pretty well what you'd see.
Yeah, well, I was really amazed at the way you referred to the temperature of mosses being so important, and as well as the dampness. So there are obviously times when moss is there as an insulator, and then other times when moss is there holding warm air and gradually creating almost like an electric blanket, a nice warm space for adders. And then there's pushed off on that tiny little snow flea that can survive is visible in the snow on the mosses, but specifically, seems to survive cold in the polytrichum. So
yeah, I mean, it may be that, I mean, I haven't really thought about it a great deal, but maybe it is because these mosses do warm up on some days, and that's why some of these creatures, like the snow flea that's active in the winter, lives in amongst that moss, but it always seems to be associated with that moss. So it's maybe it is due to the temperature. But it did surprise me, because I always think of mosses as being damp things, but actually the ones that grow out on the moor are actually, they do dry out quite significantly, and that is part of their natural state. So they're not always damp and wet. Sometimes of the year they're quite dry, and at this time they're quite warm as well.
So and we also get told many times, in this project, when we're thinking about mosses and thinking about how to knit and sew a moss, different ways of presenting mosses and imagining mosses, that they grow all over the planet in all the different habitats. So that ability to control temperatures, hold temperatures, survive big variations in temperatures, maybe a really highly significant thing, that so they can survive on deserts, and they can survive the glaciers, and they can survive in the woods. We have had a comment asking where was that woodland again, John?
It's just near Venford Reservoir. So if you go to Venford Reservoir in Dartmoor and then walk towards Bench Tor, and then there's a path which you'll find in the woodlands there. It's actually a pipeline path which comes from or a path under which a pipe is buried from the reservoir, which takes water away from the reservoir. So there's actually a really nice path through the wood, even though the wood's really rocky and quite difficult to walk in. There's a lovely path which can take you around on a loop. So it's a lovely walk to do.
Yeah, great. One last question then is about the snow fleas, and this sort of relates to all the life cycles that exist in the moss that is like totally out of human sight most of the time, which is whether snow fleas themselves are predators. Are they predators?
Oh yes, yeah, they'll predate other. I've never seen what they eat, but they will eat other insects, and some of the other scorpion flies will feed on dead insects, but they'll also feed on live ones, I think, as well. But I'm not entirely sure what. But probably springtails, because everything eats those.
Yeah, it seems like springtails are a massive harvest.
They're lunch for a lot of things.
Great. Well, thanks a lot.
Right.
That's I think it sparked all our imaginations, as well as our knowledge, all that wildlife that's relying on mosses in their habitat, as well as relying on mosses for finding the food. So we're so pleased that we asked you to give us that talk. Thank you, John.
Okay.
So coming with the imagination and the creativity, we as Art and Energy have been working with mosses and creating this mossy carpet, as well as hopefully opening people's eyes to the role of mosses in the environment. But one of our things that we're constantly asking people to share with us is examples of the way they've been creative to answer the question, how do we want to see the future? you know, getting creative for a brighter, greener future and sharing how we're doing that and thinking about all the small things that we could do to be more moss-like, more interesting and quietly small, but together making a much bigger difference. So we have a club called Bury the Giant Club, and there's a couple of hundred people that are members so far, and our efforts to share on there are a little bit sporadic, but some of those members have been doing amazing things. And if any of you on the chat are members of that club or have been doing anything recently, please share it. But we've got a couple of minutes. One of those hopefully will be occupied by Jenny, to just share something that you've been doing recently, Jenny, and then I can share one or two bits that I've been doing.
Yeah.
And me too. I can as
oh,
well.
Oh, good.
I
Is it
know
going to
Chloe
be
was a-
upside down, Chloe?
Absolutely.
Yeah, good. Right, Jenny, what do
Okay,
you
so
want
one of
everybody?
the things that I did before Christmas, so as I think is kind of on trend in a way, but is also me just something we've as a family been doing for a few years is charity shopping for Christmas presents. And I found a dress which actually I bought for myself because I really liked it. But it was a lovely, well, I think it's lovely, knitted dress with a nice cowley neck, but it didn't have a pocket. So I thought, well, I really like it. Surely I can kind of be more moss in terms of adding to and embellishing. So I unstitched some of the stitches and knitted in a new pocket, which is multicolored because it uses lots of different bits of yarn that were left over from other projects. And then in the very top of the pocket, you can see this in this funny light, but I stitched in a little bit of green moss in the kind of the join, and I've stitched in the words "Be More Moss." So it's subtle when I'm wearing it, but it is there, and it's not just adding in a secret pocket. And then the other things I wanted to say about were, this is the beginning. It hasn't got a tardigrade yet, but this is the third tardigrade telephone. So this one is now all set up to record messages at events because we've got all these events coming up. So that's been fun, including the speaker on this phone. This is an old retro phone. There's the microphone wasn't working. So Naomi had a recording device, a much more modern recording device, but it's one that sadly no longer worked. So I've taken that apart and used one of this piece of kit. The microphone's quite chunky, big thing. But the ones in this modern bit of kit that Naomi had, it's got 3 or 4 tiny little microphones. So one of those out of there, glue gunned into the bottom of a yogurt pot, fits quite nicely into the handset and wired in. It's now recording. So that's my sort of Be More Moss in terms of the bit of begging, borrowing, and putting together and making it work. And yeah,
Thanks.
so we now have a cream one, a red one, and a green one.
And a green one, brilliant. I didn't realise you'd taken those little microphones. Good. And Chloe, do you want to show us?
I do, yes. My upside down world is still here. So
Yeah.
I also have been the charity shop, and but what I was wanting to do was to learn some different stitches. So I've been learning how to do embroidery and darning by upcycling a jean jacket, which is nice. And the other thing that and this one, I'm really particularly pleased with this. Like, you can find tutorials on YouTube, and this tutorial showed me how to make petals or kind of leaflets. So they don't just have to be kind of flat on the surface. You can make really 3-dimensional stuff, which I thought was really fun. And the other creative thing that I didn't ever think I would do, but have landed up doing, was to, I don't know, can you see this? It's upside down anyway. I've written a story called Maiden's Plums, and it's got mosses and giants in it. And that's another thing that I've been up to. So that's
for sale on our website.
It is for sale on our website. If anyone fancies a short story, that's a thing to maybe consider reading.
Great, thank you, Chloe. And very, very briefly, we also put together, for those that are new to this, we put together another book about moss. It's called The Mossellany, which is a whole load of facts about mosses combined with questions about how we live and how perhaps we could be more moss. But finally, I'm rather slow at getting myself together creatively in terms of what we're doing at the moment, but I have done some drawing, which you can see me through, done some drawing of cells that are from a micro electron microscope of sphagnum. And then I've transferred those drawings on top of some cloth with some cyanotype, and I've given this is going to be a stuffed tardigrade, but I've transferred that onto that cloth, and that will then create a tardigrade which might have a speaker in it, which is going to speak all and everyone's lovely messages about the small actions they're taking, or it's going to become a doorstop. I'm not quite sure what this one is going to do, but I intend to do a bit of embroidery as well or something. So that's that, and I think we're over the time, aren't we, everybody? So it's just after 7:30, and so thank you very much for watching and hearing all about mosses, 10 more mosses on Dartmoor from Tim Purches, and all those mini bees that depend on moss and the moss's temperature. So thank you. Thank you everyone for coming along, and we'll see you next time. We haven't got a date yet, I don't think, but in about a month's time, we'll be sharing the next Moss Stories broadcast. Thank you. Bye-bye then.
Bye then. Cheers.
Thanks very much.
Bye. Take care, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.